So this is the official title of my talk. No. Anyway, I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy I finally made it out. Mark is, says that I was avoiding him basically for 3 years, but the first time it was like the same time as Build, and I already had tickets or something. And then I live in California. It's not totally super easy to get over here, and I think for like the last couple of years, I'd been at another conference over here like 2 or 3 weeks like before or after, and I was like, as much as I would love to take a 5-week European vacation, it's not totally doable. So anyway, SV, not for me, not my actual talk title, of course. And after Chris's talk, I thought I was going to be super funny and just have it be my first slide. Everyone would roll in the aisles or whatever. But then I was like, wow, that was really awesome. So, well, maybe, except everyone would then steal all of my art and put it on everything. So I have to be like a little sad. It's great for icons and stuff like that, but if I put all my artwork up in full SVG form, because I do work entirely in vector, then you guys would all have like free t-shirts until Kingdom Come, basically. Yay! Yeah, so do that, please. No. So mostly what I do for a living is lettering, and it's really fun to come and talk to a bunch of web design people because I don't do it for a living, I do it for fun. So one of the things I always like to start with when I'm not speaking to like my native type nerds or just graphic designers as a whole is why would a lettering person be in front of you right now, since half of you are developers and stuff like that. So mostly it's because of my procrastinating projects. So procrastinawork is a word that I came up with to describe the work that I do when I'm doing things I'm not supposed to be doing. So the way that I'm able to maintain momentum with all of my work is to constantly have a lot of things going on. I'm really bad when I only have one project. You guys that work on these like enormous websites and get to devote like 7 months at a time to one project, I don't know how you do it other than like just drinking at the end of the day, because it is impossible for me to work that way. I always have to have like a lot of stuff going on so that I could be constantly hopping between, the thing that is actually paying the bills and the things that aren't. So it's my procrastinating projects that kind of got me noticed within the web community, first off, because I have immense respect for people that do web work or people that do any work that, in general, people are trying to replace by machines. So all of us, we need to appreciate ourselves and all the things that we do. Type people have the same thing. We're like, I don't know, my computer makes fonts for me. What's the big deal about that? But these side projects, one of them was I made this flowchart called Should I Work for Free? And I put it up as a 2,200 pixel wide JPEG on shouldiworkforfree.com, and all the nerds had a meltdown at me because it took so long to load. And I was like, I'm a lettering person, this isn't what I do. But instead of just being like, fuck you guys, I decided to put it in HTML, and it's a lot of absolutely placed things. And please do not peek at it, because I made it years ago when I was first learning this shit, so it's not the most semantically perfect thing in the world. And another web-based project that I ended up doing was our own wedding invitation website, though I was more art director than developer on this one. Russ did all the heavy lifting development-wise. But this was a really, we basically just ran with the Nike Better World stuff like everyone was doing at the time. And, but it ended up getting in front of a lot of eyes, even the website Gawker, that they wrote an article about it titled, "The World's Most Hipster Website Makes Us Want to Outlaw Love." And they described it as like 2 Wes Anderson movies started fucking each other, which is pretty cool. I was actually kind of pumped because I used to read Gawker a lot when we lived in New York and always felt like it was that's when you've made it, is when you've been skewered by Gawker over some shit that you've done in your life. And I was like, done, check off. But yeah, I love making stuff that either sites that are really informative or things that are just silly or make a comment on how people are reacting to something. So I had a bunch of friends that were having a meltdown about aging out of all the 30 under 30 competitions. So I made a website called thousandsUnder90.com. So it's thousands under and then the numbers 90. And you can give yourself an award for anything that you want. So there's 2 form fields. It's just who you are, and then what it is that you do for a living, and it outputs this certificate for you that you can then screen grab and say that you've won an award in your life. So Düsseldorf, I've given you an award as an excellent place to nerd out. So my actual talk title is My Illustrious Ascent Towards Less Exciting Work. And one thing that I will tell you guys is that this will be a code-free talk, so if that hurts your feelings, you might want to leave. But I'm assuming that most of you are fine with a break from code for a minute. So anyway, the whole the ascent towards less exciting work I'll get through when I'm explaining my work stuff, but like anybody that went to art school or anybody that dreamt of becoming a graphic designer, or I didn't dream of becoming a graphic designer. I thought I would somehow make a living by drawing whatever I wanted all day long, like a proper artist. But I ended up falling in love with design, and thank God, because you can have a career in it relatively easily versus being a painter or something like that. But like most people, when I started out, the word artist was something that was so extreme. I used to make jokes all the time that when people enter art school, they have pink hair and piercings all over the place, and then when they leave, they look like normal people because they're fine. They accept that they are an artist. They don't have to shout it to the world. And I feel like a lot of us in the kind of work that we do when we're first starting out in our careers, we're shouting to the world what we do. We have to make the thing that is the most extreme version of everything that we do. So the kind of work that I was doing when I started off, and this is even a few years into my career, was a lot more illustrative than the kind of work that I'm doing now, which sometimes looks a little bit like this. So a lot of people would look at it and say, this is not as exciting as the work that I was doing in the past, but what excites you changes as you move on in your career, and I think that it's really difficult to appreciate subtlety when you're first starting out. In the web world equivalent, I would say it's the difference between maybe sharperfx.com, if you guys have visited that at all. They are purveyors of the world's most disgusting Flash websites, including the mime religious organization or something. I really suggest that you look at this if you haven't seen it. But what ends up happening is we all started off, I did Flash when I was in college. Flash was the thing to do, and everybody has made 1 or 2 Flash websites in their life, I'm sure. But now we're all at this point where we're just oh my God, just take away all the anything. And this is the website motherfuckingwebsite.com that basically just makes fun of everything that is proper web design. It's hilarious. It's responsive when it says, "You dumbass, you thought you needed media queries to be responsive, but no, responsive means that it responds to whatever motherfucking screen size is viewed on. This site doesn't care if you're on an iMac or a motherfucking Tamagotchi." It's really very funny. But anyway, so it means that as much as I love crazy, shiny, rainbow nonsense, I'm kind of a crazy, shiny, rainbow nonsense person. I really do have to appreciate the forms for what they are without all the decoration. So really, the more I move on in my career, it becomes way more about the letter forms, way more about the basic shapes than about all of the nonsense surrounding it. And if you look at a lot of my earlier work, I was just so in love with making just the loudest, most decorative stuff in the whole universe that sometimes the letter forms didn't get to where they should have been. But I started off in lettering. I kind of made my way into it via going to art school for drawing stuff, becoming a graphic designer, realizing that you can draw type as a graphic designer, but not really. Most people are pretty terrible at it. But the more I started practicing, the more people believed in me and would hire me to do it. And I made this project called Daily Drop Cap when I was just quitting my day job, and I wanted a way to show everyone that I was still interested in drawing lettering, even if I wasn't getting paid to do it every day. So this project, in which I illustrated a letter a day for 12 alphabets, ended up just completely changing the course of my career. And that's a lot of what side projects can end up doing for you, is that, client work is amazing. I really love doing client work. I'm not one of those people that's ever gonna be oh, no clients forever, whatever, fuck those guys. Because I really like client work. I love working with other people. And as long as I can work with good people, it's always good. And sorry, I'm using a handheld mic too. I have a cough right now, and I wanted to not subject you guys to that in case it happened. But it ended up starting so much in my career. So I ended up getting a lot of work that was, either giant letter forms, like this piece that I did for Fortune magazine. These are the sketches, and then here's the final art. So my sketches can be pretty tight. It depends on the kind of client that I'm working for. If I'm working for a client that then has to pitch my work to the actual client, like an art director that I'm working with that has to pitch me, I'll end up doing much more tight sketches. But if I'm working directly with an art director and there's not a ton of faces involved that have to okay everything, I'll tend to work a lot more loosely. But this sort of work ended up like all of a sudden taking over my portfolio. And then originally I was doing a lot more narrative illustration work, and then more and more I was getting these more letter-based projects. And these are some more recent projects too. So I'm kind of jumping around timeline-wise, but that's okay. You guys aren't here for just a dog and pony show. So I ended up doing like monograms are a really fun way to work with letter forms, and one of the ways that's probably the most closely linked with my daily drop cap project, where I was working with a single letter form, and sometimes now I get to work with like multiple letter forms. But these were for a vineyard in California, and we ended up letter pressing and foil stamping the labels. And this has, I kind of have creative freedom to do kind of whatever I want on these labels, as long as they don't look that far away from the original winery's aesthetic. So instead of just doing one monogram and adjusting colors and stuff like that, I decided to do a monogram for every release that we have. So hopefully this ends up turning into a really long-term project in which I can do a ton of awesome monograms. And I'm pretty much just paid in wine by them, because that happens sometimes. I'm totally into bartering. I'm super into it, actually. I like the party nails thing that you saw earlier. That girl is just like a bartender in San Francisco that sets up these like party nails things where she paints people's nails for $20 a pop and like paints insane shit on people's nails. And I was so obsessed with her and like this whole idea of just like going to the bar and getting your nails done that I was like, let me do a logo for you only for you to do my nails whenever I come to these things, which has probably translated into like $40 worth of manicures for a logo. But the biggest project that came of sort of like my initial daily drop cap exploration was this series that I've just completed with Penguin called Penguin Drop Caps. So Penguin had contacted me maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, this art director, Paul Buckley, who's really awesome, and I had worked with him on another cover before, and he said, you know, I really love this drop cap project. I want to figure out a way for you to work with Penguin Classics. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'm sure that'll happen. And then a year and a half later, he came back and had actually pushed it through the editorial director and everything like that, and the project was real. So I ended up doing 26 books. It's the full alphabet, as you could expect. And they chose some really, really interesting titles for the series, too. And as you'll probably notice, it goes from like red to yellow to green to blue. So it makes the rainbow spectrum when you get through all of it. And this was a really, really exciting project, and it's an exciting project for me to talk about with people, because a lot of people just assume that we're repurposing the letters that I had drawn originally for Daily Drop Cap, which isn't true at all. So each of the letters is drawn specifically for the cover and based on the content. So I love doing book cover work. It's one of my favorite things to do, mostly because most of the time you actually do have to read most of the book in order to make anything happen. So people that do more narrative illustration can kind of rely on what Wikipedia tells them to do in order to like come up with a cover design. But people that work in more abstract mediums, I mean, web design's kind of an abstract medium too, all things considered. You have to really understand the content, and you have to do your research in order to make something appropriate for that client. So, you know, whenever you guys are designing stuff, you always have to like go through all of your crazy brainstorming stuff to figure out what font feels appropriate for it and stuff like that. I have to do that, but also, you know, creating the letter forms themselves. So here's how some of that process works. So the sketches that I would do for Paul, which I could be a little more loose with because he is an art director and he was kind of like the man in charge. I would read the book. In this case, I kind of didn't read Moby Dick, but don't tell anyone that. No, but that's only because I was assigned like 4 books at a time, and in this 6-week session, I was supposed to read Moby Dick and Swan's Way from Proust at the same time. And I was like, that's a lot of reading, probably not going to get through both of those, and I'll definitely try and read as much as Swan's Way as I can, since that's much more ethereal and like has to, you know, I'd have to get a better sense of the setting and whatnot. I was like, Moby Dick, probably something with whales, that'll suffice. So as you can see, there are 2, one's with whales and one with a spear, and the one with the spear was the one that ended up getting chosen. So here you can see the sketch and the final next to each other. So I tend to not trace my sketches exactly, mostly because I'm not like a crazy grid person. Like, I think if you work with gridded notebooks when you're sketching, you tend to just draw everything in boxes. So what I like to do is put a sheet of gridded paper behind my sketch page and like work with it initially just to kind of map it out. But then I take it away as soon as I can, just because otherwise everything that I make just feels like it's the same proportions all the time. But yeah, so then when I actually put the sketch into Illustrator, I had to scale it a little bit just because it was too wide for the book. And then this was another title. This was one of my most fun books to read, which was a title called Five Children and It. And the author's last name began with an N, so it was Nesbit. And this is like a crazy children's story from 1905 or 1908 or something, in which a sand fairy grants these children wishes, which end up being really disastrous. And the sand fairy sounds like the creepiest thing I've ever imagined in my mind, which has like snail eyes and bat wings for ears, and it's just like this little pudgy creature that comes out of the ground. So I definitely wanted that to be like prominent in parts of my sketch. So he's kind of hiding out in a couple of the sketches, but is more prominently featured in the one on the left, and that's the one they ended up choosing. So here are two digital versions of my the cover. So the one on the left, I just live traced my sketch, and you can see why live trace doesn't always work out great. Live tracing is a really good option so I wanted to show you guys like a little bit of digitization stuff just because Chris talked about using Illustrator and stuff like that. I've done a talk or two before where I did like live vector drawing in front of people, but I thought you guys would think that was really boring. So we're not doing that today. I do have a slide which I'm showing a little bit of it and I'll talk through. But I hardly ever live trace things. It can be really handy if you're already working with really, really clean high-res black and white graphics. But what it does do is it puts points all over the place. So when you're plotting vector points, you want to plot them real specifically so that they're sort of like minimal and on the extrema, which I'll talk about in a second if you can. And whenever you live trace stuff, it kind of tosses them all over the place, which is completely fine if whatever you're live tracing, that's the final art. But a lot of times for me, I end up needing to adjust things ever so slightly, especially if you're working with like a pretty complicated illustration and you need to simplify it because you are scaling it down for like an icon or something like that. And in which case, like the enemy you know is kind of better. Like the more drawing that you're doing instead of trusting the machine's drawing, the easier it is to manipulate later. So when I actually draw, I end up just tossing down my sketch in Illustrator. Hopefully I do not have to, go back. It should be auto-playing. No? Is it going? No. I don't know how to make this thing, whatever. Oh, wait, is it going now? Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. It was some weird thing where I had to like advance it twice. So anyway, this is kind of like a cheaty thing to show you because it's mostly rules. But as you can see, when I plot my points, I'm plotting them always on the north and south first. Type designers tend to draw things on the extrema, which are the extreme north, south, east, and west points. And the reason why you do that is all sort of like rendering issues and stuff like that, and lots of complex, true nerdery that I can't speak to specifically since I don't focus on that. But the reason why I always start with the north and south points is that it makes it the most easy for me to manipulate. So I'll add in those east and west points when I need them, but ultimately starting with just the north and south means that if I want to make a crazy broad change, I'm not moving tons and tons and tons of points, just a couple of them. So I add a west point on this guy because obviously that's not going to fly just being that vertical there. And there's all sorts of tricks that I can tell you guys about actual vector plotting and stuff like that, but it would be like me talking for an hour about things that I can't visualize in front of you. But some of the things that you really need to consider is like minimal points when possible, and usually when you're fucking up, it's because you have too many points or too few points. Making sure that whenever you're starting, whenever you have a curve and then a flat area, that you have a point at the beginning of a curve and a point at the exit of a curve. So if you think about a rounded rectangle, that's why there's those 2 points in each of the corners. So there's a ton of stuff to consider. There's a lot of tutorials online about great vector drawing, so I won't talk your ear off about it, but that's my tiny bit of live drawing in front of you. So what I'll end up doing is using my sketch initially behind me just to get the basic vector points down, and then I'll turn it off and just manipulate from there. So the final ends up being quite a bit different from the sketch sometimes, but it still carries the essence of the sketch so that the client isn't going to have a meltdown at me. So books are a huge part of what I do for a living. So this was, I just was able to do the cover for Dave Eggers' most recent book, The Circle, which is hilarious because Russ, my husband, works at Facebook, and this is basically about a really scary version of Facebook. And I was like, you do know that my husband works for there? And he's like, oh, that's funny, who cares? But this was a really fun project because it was kind of more of a logo project than it was a book design project. I had to just come up with a logo for the company because the sketch that he had given me was just the circle and then a circle that said logo goes here and then Dave Eggers. I was like, all right, pretty much did the book for me there. But it was really interesting coming up with something that felt like it could be used for a tech company. I had another logo that I super liked, which was, have any of you guys ever gone to like summer camp? No? You guys, yeah, it's like a room full of dudes, whatever. So we made these things called monkey's fists, which is like a really weird name, but it's basically like a marble, and then it has like leather straps all around it, and it's a knot that you make by just pulling things like consistently tighter. And once you have it done, it takes a while to undo. So I had this idea that whatever the logo would be, it would be influenced by these knots that become like harder and harder to take apart the more tightly you weave it. So all of the logo proposals that I had shown were kind of influenced by that. Same thing with the one that they ended up choosing, because that's sort of how social media works, right? It's like once you're in, it's hard to get out. But I had a lot of fun expanding it for the case wrap and stuff like that. And books are one of the things that I enjoy doing like the most. And these sort of like vintage-inspired covers are something that I ended up doing a lot of, mostly because I've always been interested in this kind of thing, like since I started studying typography, but then also I worked for a designer named Louise Feely, and she introduced me to a lot of awesome like vintage-inspired stuff, and I did a lot of that for her when I was working for her. So this is a huge part of the kind of work that I do right now, is this kind of stuff. And what I can say to whenever you're working with like sort of like trying to theme it around a decade or around a time frame or something like that, I tend to not do an outrageous amount of research on like the day or very close to when I'm about to do this project, because I think it's really, really easy to rip off subject matter if you're doing research like the same day that you're executing. So what I always try to advise people to do is, if they're interested in this kind of work, just to kind of research generally throughout life. Like just think about your life as being like a big, long research journey in which you're just absorbing everything around you. And then instead of trying to like have a crazy resource file that you're looking at immediately before making something else, you're just sort of pulling from it based on memory. So what you end up doing is like creating like much more you designs versus making something that is like incredibly derived from a specific source. So if you tried to draw one of your best friends from memory, even someone that you saw every single day, if you tried to draw your wife from memory, you would do some crazy shit to their face that like is just because you're like, oh, for whatever reason, your eyes are farther apart in my memory. And that's what ends up happening when you redraw type if you're not looking at the source material specifically. So I think it's actually really difficult to rip off people's typefaces if you're thinking about tracing it from memory instead of tracing it literally on top of it in Illustrator. And so what I end up also getting by doing stuff like that is that whenever I do kind of historically referential stuff, it's not incredibly accurate, which like I'm very upfront about that whenever I'm doing anything. I'm not trying to pass anything off as being like exactly from that time era. So this piece that I ended up doing for a talent agency called CAA was meant to be influenced by the sort of like Great Gatsby era. And I had done something initially that was more like historically accurate, but it wasn't cartoonishly enough from the 20s. So we ended up having to do something that like felt more like popular culture's understanding of what the 1920s are. And this was a really fun project for a lot of reasons. I ended up making like a website for it, which is totally dumb. It's just the invitation front and back, and when you mouse over it, it flips over. It's like, oh wow. But you guys roll your eyes at that, but normal people are like, the internet moves in front of me, So it was like, it's pretty fun when you get to like use like a super basic thing of jQuery and everyone loses their shit. So another reason why this was fun is that they sort of said in passing that if I wanted to, I could go to the party, and I like immediately said yes. And Russ and I went to this party together, which we thought would just be like, we're going to LA, going to this Hollywood party. It'll totally be weird, right? It was the weirdest thing I've ever done in my entire life. It was basically 200 A-list celebrities and then Russ and I. And we just stood there in the corner and drank like 4-finger pours of scotch for 3 hours, not talking to a single human being. Have any of you guys watched the show Party Down? No? It's really good. It got canceled, as all good things do. But it was about waiters in Hollywood and about how all the waiters in Hollywood are basically out-of-work actors. And so I was like, oh, it's cool. We'll just talk to the bartenders or waitstaff or something. And they were all like super attractive people, obviously trying to impress someone at the party. So we just sort of hung out and played the like who's behind me game. And but it was pretty cool. My family got really mad at me for not saying hi to anyone or like taking a picture or anything like that. But, and I can equate this to like anybody that's ever done any public speaking or something like that, where there's always the speaker's dinner or something like the night before an event. I love going to like everything about conferences. I will be like dancing at the party. I'm that kind of person. Russ might not be because it's a lot for him to be dancing. I know you love dancing, but you know, conferences full of people, you know, it's a thing. And I'm just like endlessly extroverted. He's like a social introvert, so it works out. But anyway, it was just like obvious to me that this party was like the night, this was the speaker's dinner, and that if I like went over and was like, hey, can I talk to you, it would have been a major interruption. Plus, you can't really like walk over to George Clooney telling a story to like Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence and be like, what are you guys doing? You know. There's like no easy in. I thought for sure that I had an in because I had done some like Hollywood work that year, but it didn't work out. So a lot of the work that I do now ends up looking kind of on the sexy side. Like this is something that I did with Dove, where they actually ended up like making it in real chocolate, and then photographing it, and of course all the nonsense that goes with photographing chocolate in terms of photoshopping. But the kind of files that I end up handing over to these sorts of clients look a little bit more like this. So like now, in terms of like the less exciting work, a lot of the work that I'm doing, this is very exciting to me. But if you told like an intern or something that this is what they would be doing all day and not actually like cutting it out of chocolate, they would probably like run for the hills. And same thing with this campaign that I just finished up for Starbucks. So they ended up using my lettering and making all this really awesome stuff out of it. They made these like, they cast chocolate and made this like, I don't know how they made this crazy flan thing, but they did it. And then they had a commercial in which someone was drawing with caramel, and that definitely was not me. But the kind of files that I ended up handing over to them look more like this. So it's not, like this to me is very exciting, but at the final is extra exciting because I don't actually I don't have to do that, and then someone else does it for me, which is kind of nice. But if I wasn't excited by the actual drawing of the type itself, like my life would suck. Like I would not be in this career, because a lot of times stuff like this, I'll do a version, and then the job ends up getting killed. And if I was only waiting for the payoff, if I was only waiting for that awesome final crazy pizzazzy file, I would only have like excellent feelings, like 1 out of every 5 times. So the letter forms have become like my new favorite thing, and I'm completely fine working on like stripped down black and white stuff. I love doing logo work. This was something I did for a new magazine that's coming out in California called the California Sunday magazine, that's meant to be like New York Mag, but for New York Times magazine, but for California. And this is the kind of work that it excites me now, but it's not that I don't still love doing the more illustrative work. It's just that when I do it, I care more about the letters, And these are 2 pieces. One is something that I did a while ago that says "Say it with flowers." It's what's written on all of the packaging whenever you buy flowers for someone at a florist. And then the one on the right was something that I made for Florence and the Machine. So the one on the right is still like, it's a very illustrative piece. It's very calligraphic, but there's not as many like insanity mistakes as the one on the left. The one on the left, like all the mistakes are hidden by all the flowers and nonsense that's all around it. But there's definitely some like crazy spacing issues and some like inverted stress on stuff. The fact that the W has like weight on all 3 sides, but the O only has weight on 1 side, and the S is like way heavier than a lot of the other things. These are stuff that I notice now that I have a really hard time repeating in my work, which a lot of times can happen. Clients see work that's up on your website and ask you to do that thing again, and now I have a really hard time doing it because I know too much. But I still really do love doing illustrative work. It's just that now I spend way more time agonizing over the letter forms and less time feeling totally pumped that I made it through them, so now I can put decorations on top. And the time in which it's most clear that you're focused on the letter forms, of course, is when you're working on typefaces or type themselves. So I was able to work on the titles for Moonrise Kingdom, which is a Wes Anderson movie. It's not his most recent one. It's the one that came out right before that, which was awesome. And my reaction to getting hired for that job was this. So I pretty much had a meltdown. I didn't believe it was real, because if you guys know this, anytime that you work for cool people, the budgets are usually not outrageously high. And while they paid me like okay for this, like well enough for this project. It was like respectable. It wasn't so much that I felt like sometimes when you get paid for a client job that's like for a big ad agency or something, you're like, they're not gonna kill this job because they've already put too much money over at me or something like that. But in this case, they could have walked away after like working with me for 2 weeks and it would have been fine. You know, I put like 4 months of work into it and like probably could have made that in a week if I had been working on normal projects. But it was still amazing opportunity to work on, and I just had a complete blast working on the project, specifically because I got to work directly with Wes Anderson, which was actually pretty amazing. So here's the process of kind of working on this project, where they had recommended that I looked at Ed Bengat's Edwardian script to start with, but they thought that it was like too formal, too wedding-y. They really wanted to make sure that it felt like a little just more appropriate for the film, which was set in like 1962 New England. And so I started originally working really close to the source material because they were so specific about what they wanted. So, you know, it always takes a little bit to get to know your client and get to figure out what it is that they are actually asking you to do. And Wes was, you know, hard because he like knows exactly what he wants, and it just takes him a little while to verbalize it. So we just kind of had to work through a few iterations before we landed on something he was really into. So first, just making it a bit more bold, you know, getting it to work on all those little shitty screens on the back of people's airplane seats. And then I also tried one that was a monoline version because I thought it was pretty cool. Even though that way that the M ends on the end is pretty embarrassing right now. I should probably adjust that at some point. But then Wes ended up sending me these titles from this Claude Chabrol film and said, you know, this feels like a little bit more appropriate. It feels more hand-done, less perfect. Like, what can we do to get that back in there? So I ended up, you know, sort of basing some of my explorations on that. I looked at a bunch of different source material that were kind of similar, and then ended up with this. My only feedback that I got back was make the M look more like this M, which was attached as like a high-res TIFF to an email for some reason. Like, so the two things that I can tell you about interacting with Wes Anderson via email is that all of his images are TIFFs, and I have no idea why. And he's definitely an accidental all caps person. Like, so sometimes I would get like, you should make the M into this M, maybe, you know, and I'm just like, I know that you're not screaming, but I feel it right now. So ultimately, this was what ended up being created. So I moved forward and was able to I did lettering for the front credits and a typeface for the back, but I ended up actually creating two separate typefaces for the project, just because they were like, oh, it's cool, we'll just use another typeface for all the posters and stuff. And we were so far along that I was just like, oh, let me do all this free extra work for you, no problem. I just want to make sure that, you know, it all looks great. So these were the two typefaces that I ended up making. It's actually one typeface, but in two weights. And the thing that was really unique and interesting about this project is that the weights are not sort of like classic weights, like bold and regular. They're optical weights, so they're meant to be the same weight, just used at two separate sizes. So there's some subtle differences between them. It's actually like a lot harder to see usually on a display than it is on when it's printed out or something like that. But one of the main differences, of course, is that you can get a little crazier with display weights when it comes to swashiness. Whenever you guys see display and text versions of typefaces, it usually means that there's higher contrast on the display, which means that there's a bigger difference between the thicks and the thins. And that's just because if you're working with a text typeface, you know, it doesn't need to have that difference, and actually like that works against it when you use it small, because those little thins are going to go away. And you guys know that specifically when you're talking about working with pixel stuff, you know, that if things aren't hinted well, everything looks like shit, you know, and not that we care, like, you know, not like everybody cares about, you know, hinting and stuff like that, but there are plenty of Microsoft people, and I'm positive there's lots of Microsoft people in this audience, developers. But another thing is that you'll have a higher X height on the text face. So on the one on the left, there is the text version, and the X height is the height of the lowercase letters. So it's higher just because that automatically makes the typeface bigger. So if you're talking about a typeface that has a really low lowercase, you end up having to use it a lot larger in order to actually be able to read it more clearly. So if it automatically has a higher X height, then it's a lot easier to read. And when you're looking through Typekit, or you're looking through like any of the web font services, and you're looking for a typeface to use below like, you know, 15 or 14 pixels, you're going to look for something that has a nice high X height so that it's easy to read, and that you don't have to worry about scaling it up, and you're going to get more bang for your buck in terms of line width and stuff like that. So here's what the end credits ended up looking like. They originally, when I had set this, I had used Engraver's Gothic, which is like a kind of wide sans serif typeface, and paired it with it, and I thought that looked really awesome. But then Wes was like, oh, I don't know if I like that one. Why don't we use Helvetica? And then I had a meltdown and had this like 5,000 word email that was very respectful that I was about to send, just because, Helvetica, everyone loves it, whatever. Eric's coming to talk tomorrow. He'll, whatever. You guys love that movie. But Helvetica only pairs well with Helvetica. Have you guys tried to use it on your websites? It looks great with other weights of Helvetica, and everything else is like impossible to use it with. So ultimately, they ended up using the script entirely, and which I think is like not the most legible, but it ended up being awesome in the end credits just because they had it flying around the screen and doing all crazy nonsense. It was pretty good. So type design is something that I love to do. I don't feel like I'm ready to do it full time yet, just because it is so you work so differently as a type designer than you do as just a letter or a graphic designer. You're creating systems, so basically it's like switching from doing like all like UI and front end to doing just like entirely crazy back end PHP nonsense all the time. So it's one of those things that people shift into because they get more nerdy. And so I am becoming more nerdy, so I will become a typeface designer at some point, but I don't know when that exact transition will be. For now, what I end up doing is using typeface design as a tool in the same way like you guys could learn Illustrator to create SVG files and stuff like that. So I end up using typeface design to create assets for my own lettering projects. In the case of this one, which was a cover for a Criterion collection, I ended up making a typeface because there was enough stuff going on with these titles that it was just easier for me to create kind of a half-baked typeface than it was to make like to do all the lettering on its own. So this is what the end typeface ended up looking like. It's not complete in any way, shape, or form, but that's okay because it's just for my own use. And when you're making typefaces, this is kind of what the environment looks like. So I use RoboFont, which is it's becoming kind of a standard, like the industry standard software within the typeface design industry. And it's really fun. It's just like an easy vector environment, just like Illustrator, but you're working like with each individual letter form instead of on one giant artboard. So it has a much lower like point of entry than you'd think. So if you guys have ever worked with vector drawing before, you can work with a font making software and be like relatively good at it. And it's also one of those things too, if you ever did want to make like an icon font or something like that, if you owned a license to this software, you can basically just like draw in Illustrator, copy, if you don't feel comfortable drawing in here, copy the vectors in from Illustrator as long as they're scaled up enough. And then you can actually create your own vector fonts icon fonts pretty easily. So it'd be worth investigating if that's something that you're super into. I definitely spent a lot of time when I first started learning this software creating icon fonts for friends, just because they'd be like, here's all the icons, and I'd be like, 20 minutes later, here's your icon font. It's definitely not that difficult to do if you already have the vector stuff drawn. So I ended up being able to design the Friday night party again, which was really fun. And this should also play, but I guess it doesn't feel like playing right now. Oh, it's totally spacebar. I figured it out. So this is responsive, sort of. I mean, it is. I made those clouds through trickery. They're just absolutely placed, whatever. And it just cycles through images using like jQuery, which is like, this is like the extent of my web nerdery that I do on a daily basis now. But it would be super cool if I did this in SVG, then I would be a real nerd. But I ended up making a typeface for this project, even though it was a really small project, just because I was using this sans serif enough throughout the project that it made sense. So typeface design as a supplement to my own lettering work has been really handy. And you guys do this too. You make your own plugins for stuff just to make your job easier. It's the same thing for me, but with typeface design. And so this is what the typeface ended up looking like. And I actually ended up selling this one on my site, which was fun. So Silencio Sans, it's called. And then I think this is the last project that I'm going to show you guys, which is another one of those projects where a friend asked me to design their wedding invitation for them, or just to help them out in whatever way I could. And I'm a crazy person, so I decided to make an entire typeface for it. But But it was really fun. I've always wanted to do something influenced by this book, the Mira Calligraphae Monumenta, which is like this crazy book in which this master penman and this like awesome Dutch minuscule painter like basically collaborated between 30 years of, you know, like one of them did it and then they just went back and forth. And I have always wanted to do something influenced by it, but never had an excuse. So this became my perfect excuse to do it. So I ended up making a typeface that was more simplified, and then I added the swashes after. So again, another instance where the typeface design is supplementing my lettering work because it just made my job easier by doing so. In making all the letter forms in this environment in which I could, you know, make a U and then make universal changes to that U from that point on, it became a lot easier for me to like move forward, especially if I had corrections. So the title then that I had should maybe be adjusted to more subtle work rather than less exciting work. And I think that's sort of like how we end up, you know, working in our careers, is that we just notice the details so much more and care so much more about those details that the details end up being what excites us most. And the project, I do have one more project. The project that ended up doing that the most for with me is the MailChimp logo redesign. So on the actual sponsor slide, I think they're using the old logo. But I recently was able to work with MailChimp and redesigning their logo. And this kind of work totally excites me a lot. Taking something that is like mostly there and just like turning it up to 11 a little bit. You know, taking something that was fine, you know, that no one was really complaining about. But making it something that feels a little bit more considered and sophisticated. And when I was posting this to my site, I knew that a lot of people wouldn't be able to see a lot of the differences that I was applying to the logo, so I tried to, as much as possible, go through and actually show what I was doing. So here's a couple of the examples of stuff that I did. So opened it up, tight areas for better legibility, something that you should always look at when working with scripts especially. Straighten the baseline a bit so it kept its penmanship feel but like felt a little easier to read. And then another big thing was overall the weight was lightened when the strokes joined each other. So one of the things that people end up doing when they start trying to do lettering work is that they'll try and draw like Futura or something, and they'll take a circle next to a rectangle and say like, oh, it's Futura. But there's so much more that goes on than that, and there's a lot of cuts into the letter to like adjust for weight. And most people, before they're told to notice it, don't notice it. And then once you notice it, you can't unsee. So these were just some of the things that I ended up doing to the logo type to make sure that it was a little bit more legible, ultimately too, so that it was more flexible at smaller sizes. So Illustrious Ascent towards more subtle, maybe towards less fucked up. I don't know. That's up for debate. But when you do work that's less fucked up, you also run the risk of doing work that's less accidentally awesome. So one of the things that, basically like the thing that I'll leave you with is that the further along you guys get in your careers, especially as web designers, you just learn so much about what not to do. You learn so much about how to streamline things, how to make everything like as light and fast as possible, basically like stripping away some of the fun sometimes. You know, where this is a joke obviously, but a lot of times people end up making sites that could be any site. You know, it could be a template, it could be anything. And just make sure that as your work advances and as you like get towards the less exciting work, the kind of work that I end up doing, just because that's the work that excites me the most, the work that is more subtle and the work that has less crazy doodads and flashy nonsense going on, that you don't end up making stuff that anybody could make, that it still has personality, that it's still right for the client, and that it still excites more than just a couple of nerds in the room. So, thanks.